So I'm working on creating a new wiring harness for this Speedo. This is the Speedo we're going to put on the KPM 200. It has a nice connector in the back with all these wires. This sort of wiring diagram just tells you on the Speedo which color wires to, would go to certain functions within the Speedo itself. So like an example, the blue and white goes to the fuel gauge and so forth. You're going to need to basically cut off the connectors that are on all of these wires so that we can put them into just two sort of 9-pin looms like this, because the bike underneath only has two 9-pin wires, two 9-pin sets exactly like this that control all of its functions. So we need to essentially combine all of these 4 connectors into just 2 and put them in the right order that the bike is expecting. That's where my sheet on the KPM 200 site comes in. It tells you where all of these color wires match up to the color wires on the bike. So right now I've soldered 25-inch wires to each of the wires I'm going to be using on the Speedo connector. I'm going to use all of them except there is an additional ground on this 3-pin connector here. This green ground, there's no equivalent for the bike. You can see there's like nine wires here, 6 here, 3 here, and 1 here. We need this 1 for the 6th gear because our bike has 6 gears. We don't need this additional green ground. So all of these minus this green ground is 18 wires, which is what we're going to need for this project. So I've done all of the 18 wires in this sort of white additional long extra wire. And on the end, I've marked each of the wires with the color that they're going to correspond to on the bike itself. And this is in that sheet on my website, the KPM 200 resources site. So I just marked them with Sharpies. You can see that they're all marked with different colors because this corresponds to the wire that's going to be on the bike itself. Once these are all done, I'm making the sort of the joining connector. This is going to essentially look like this when it's done. So you can see that there's 9 wires here. I'm going to put 9 more terminals on the end of these, but also connect each of these wires to here. So it's going to piggyback and come off of here. This connector is going to allow the stock Speedo to still work because the bike functions will be connected, but then it will also feed this Speedo over here. I think you're going to do this because the wiring that comes from the bike kind of comes from 2 different directions. So imagine like there's a wire that just plugs in like this on the bike, right? So there's two sets of these that plug in on the bike, and this goes to various functions of the bike, and this might go to the Speedo. But there are some wires that come from this angle that are feeding the main information like gear and whatnot. And then there's some that come from this angle that feed like the speed sensor and so forth. So that's why doing this in-between connector is kind of the best of both worlds, and you don't have to worry about rewiring much of the bike. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'll update you again when I have these connectors finished. So if you're following my guide, as you build the connectors, these 3 connectors are the actual connectors on one side of the wiring harness on the bike. Basically the side that comes from the direction of the front of the bike, right? So when you disconnect the 2 wires, 3 wires actually, that kind of power the speedometer, stock speedometer, you're going to see connectors, like this on this side. So what I'm doing is I'm creating this wiring harness. I'm doing connector 1A. I've just basically labeled each of the main connectors, 1, 2, and 3 on the bike. And you're sort of creating a pigtail that goes in between. So as you plug this into the connector in the bike, which is this one, number 16, the first one in the top left, if you look at the little, this little indentation here, this little gray trapezoid is where this part of the bike connector is, this little like receiver clip piece. You're going to be plugging this into the bike's connector and then plugging this end into the other end of where this used to connect, right? So you can just imagine this is going in between the wiring that exists now. So you have to match the colors. So 16 is on the bike is the neutral connector, neutral indicator, which is green and red on the motorcycle itself, and it just happens to be green and red on the wiring harness for what comes out of the Speedo. So I have it hooked up. I have it wired up to this red, and it looks kind of brownish, but really this is red, and it's supposed to be red and green. This is the red and green wire. It comes out of the wiring harness. This is going to get really heavy because it has tons of wires on it. But it comes out of the wiring harness, and it's going to go into this connector that way. So I'm just going to do connector number 1, 16, 17, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way to 18. On this, I'm just going to match up the wires. So when I'm done, I just plug this in between the wire that was there already. So this goes into the female side of the connector. This goes into the male side of the connector. And then it maintains the existing connection of the stock Speedo, and then also taps off each of these wires and goes to the new speedometer. And it works perfectly fine. Just the hardest part is sort of soldering up the receiver, sort of the female connector side, because that's where the 2 wires need to kind of join together. I put the sheathing, if you can see, the sheathing is actually a little bit sticking out of the connector, just because when I solder up these little receiver connector pieces, these little guys, they just don't have, especially inside the reception hole of the connector, if you will, where it gets plugged into, there just really isn't enough space for 2, larger gauge wires to fit inside there. It's a real squeeze. So I end up just soldering just the metal parts of the wire to this connector, and then just sticking it right inside here. So there's there's no pinching, and they're separate far enough apart from each other that they're not going to touch or anything. Just don't make sure there's no exposed wire on this end. Try and solder it so it goes right up to the edge of this little connector. So it just peeks out a little bit. You'll find the right amount, but you usually just have the plastic sheathing. I'll grab an example. On this side, once this gets tinned up, this is going to be connected to one of these, and I wish this was better focusing. Just make sure I always have the plastic sheathing kind of end at the end of the connector, so this will eventually get kind of soldered in that way with all the wires going straight, not sticking out like that, but this one and then plus the other one. So I'll keep going and you'll see how it is at the end. So I'm starting to build connector 2A. And again, I'm just putting these wires in, and they're going to be done in the configuration that would allow this to be plugged into the connector 2A on the bike. I just want to make mention of something. When you build these I start by building these little, 3-inch pieces of wire with this one soldered by itself. I did that because the double wires just don't fit so well in these big, male connectors. They tend to fit better in the female connectors for whatever reason. Just the way this metal pin wire sort of fits in here. There just seems to be less room in these little holes for 2 wires than they are for the other ones. So just a quick note, when you solder this, I don't know how well you can see it, but make sure the end of the wire and where the solder is kind of stops before this little clip protrusion comes out. If this wire kind of butts up against that clip protrusion, you're going to have a hard time getting it to lock inside this housing, this connector housing. Just make sure you have a little bit of space there so this clip can push all the way inside of here and really lock in place to make sure it doesn't get in the way. Okay, so I've soldered up most of the wires to this little wiring harness here, and I just wanted to show the last one that I had soldered up, because you can see that I just basically solder the wire to the connector here, and I don't really crimp this inner piece. Sorry for the focus. But I do crimp sort of the outer pieces to fold it down, and then I'm just going to insert this right inside of here, right? And then once this is done, this will snap in. Sorry for I need both hands for this. So once this is all connected, now if you were to plug it in to this bike connector, all the wires line up with the colors that are associated with these numbers, right? And then plugging this in, this will become that extension, basically, of the existing wiring. So this is one connector 1A for the bike. This is 1A ready to go. I'm just going to mark it 1A so I remember. That's what this gets plugged into. And then I'll start with connector 2A, and then I'll finish with connector 3A on the bike. So when you're done following all the directions, you should basically have 3 connectors. This first one right here, which I didn't label this yet. This one right here is the 1A connector. And this gets plugged in between the bike connectors. Sorry, it should be up here. This is the 1A connector, right? So that's the first bundle. The 1A connector is mostly the 10 through 18, which is like the gear indicators, a battery positive, basically all the way down to all the gears for the most part. So that's the 1A connector. Then you have that's the 1A connector. Then you have what I call the 2A connector. This is most of the other like ancillary things that you might have on the Speedo. So, the ignition on switch, there's no fault indicator, the RPM send, light indicator, left and right signal, the fuel sender, all the way down to a ground connection. So you still need to have all pins populated in here, because even though something like, there's for pin number 2, there's no brown red, there's no alternative fault indicator for this speedometer. It doesn't have a fault indicator light. So I just put NA here because you don't have any corresponding connector. But in here, you still need to have pin 2 populated because it needs to pass through to the main Speedo. So you can see here, pin 2 is the bottom one of this side. This is the plug on the bike with the little receiver with the hole in it. And then this, so number 2, in this case, is brown-red. So right here is number 2. And it's just white. I don't think I marked it. But usually I do mark every single one. But that's just passing right through. There's no additional wire hooked up to this middle wire here. Just a straight pass through. So there's going to be a couple of those. It'll happen on again, number 8 on the over temp indicator. So up here on the top of this connector, there's just a straight white wire right here that just goes straight through. There's nothing else connected to it. I also didn't mark it in color, but I could have. But that's also just got to be straight pass through. And then there's another one, I think, down here. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to mention this is actually the wrong style connector. It's only a 2-pin for the third connector. I wrote 3A in here, but in reality, I think it's only a 2-pin connector. I might have even repinned that. I don't remember exactly. It's been a while. But there's no additional ground. The original connector from the bike only has two wires in it. It's the speed send and the speed positive. So there's only 2 things you need, but there is an additional ground wire coming out of the Speedo. And I just hooked that up to the ground that's on the first option, right? Because there's, it's a ground green. It passes through, like there's a ground to ground. So, and there's no specific, I don't think there's any specific connection for the actual Speedo for this. See, this is NA here. Oh, that's the over connection. So the ground from the 3 times connector, I just said green ground 3X connector. That just means this one. So take the ground from here that would be part of the Speedo and just connect it to the number 9. So that's exactly what I did. You can see that on the 2A connector, there's a green wire right here. I just splice this in. This is the green wire. So it connects green to green. You can see it right in the middle there. That's number 9. I just take this green wire and it runs all the way back into this wire loom, the green wire down here. There's a bunch of ground wires. I just didn't want to leave an open ground anywhere. The black is actually to the battery in this case, so green means ground for this. So this is all wired up. I have my 2 connectors, and in this case, my 2 or 3-pin connector. I will just, I'll send, I don't remember if the stock bike had a 2-pin connector or a 3-pin connector, so I'm going to send a 3-pin connector, or I would include a 3-pin connector as well, but you'll figure it out once you get to the bike. I don't remember cutting the old connector off, but it might have been a 3-pin and I just forgot, so I made it a 2-pin, and if you need a 2-pin as well, you can add that in. It's not that hard, not a big deal. All right, so next we got to test it on the bike. So I have the new Speedo all hooked up. You can see that light indicator is working, power is on, it shows that it's in first gear. I can go up into neutral. Whoops. Go up into neutral, into second gear, third. Gotta move it to fourth. I'm turning the wheel a little bit. Let's prop this up a second. There we go. Okay. I'm going to 4th, and then 5th, and then 6th, and then back down. I got to move the wheel a little bit by hand so it goes down in the gears. There you go. And that's my tack. It's unplugged. My blinker indicators. Obviously the fuel send is working because you see it's full. My tank is completely full. I'm going to put it in neutral. Start her up. The tachometer. My high beams are on. Turn the high beams off, and then I don't have a way to make it move because it's parked right now, but the speed sensor works as well. So there we go. Your custom tack is ready.